Welcome back to Revenge Room, the place where betrayal meets justice, and every story ends with the truth finally coming to light. Today's story is called My Daughter-in-Law Called Me Trash at Christmas, then my son called at 2 a.m. What the hell is going on? Picture this, Christmas dinner. The table is set with expensive dishes, candles flickering, the smell of roasted turkey filling the air. But there is no warmth here. Only cold silence and the sharp edge of cruelty waiting to cut. A father sits at the far end of his own son's table, treated like an uninvited guest in a family he built with his own hands. And then she speaks. His daughter-in-law looks at him with disgust and says the words that will change everything. Eat fast and leave. You are nothing but trash that needs to be taken out. His son does not defend him. His son laughs. But here is what they did not know. This quiet old man they dismissed. This father they humiliated in front of his own granddaughter, he was not broken. He was waiting. He stood up slowly, put on his coat, and said 5 words that made the room go silent. This will be your last Christmas dinner together. They thought he was being dramatic. They thought he was powerless. But at 2 in the morning, when every bank account froze and every credit card was declined, his son called. Screaming, "Dad, what did you do? What did he do? Stay with me until the very end, because this story has twists you will never see coming. A villain who finally faces consequences, and a father who proves that dignity cannot be stolen from those who refuse to surrender it. This is not just revenge. This is justice served cold. My name is Walter Brooks. I am 69 years old, a retired business owner who spent 30 years building a manufacturing company from nothing, only to sell it all when my wife Margaret was diagnosed with cancer 8 years ago. I would make that choice again in a heartbeat. She was worth every penny, every sacrifice, every moment I spent holding her hand instead of holding meetings. She passed 6 years ago, and I have been living quietly ever since, trying to stay close to my son Evan and my granddaughter Sophie, trying to be the kind of father and grandfather who shows up without being a burden. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being family. I became furniture. Christmas Eve at my son's house should have felt like home. The decorations were beautiful. I will give Vanessa that much. Crystal ornaments catching the light, a 12-foot tree that probably cost more than my first car. Candles flickering on every surface like something out of a magazine. But beauty without warmth is just staging. And that house, for all its perfection, felt like a stage where I had been assigned a very small role. I sat at the far end of the dining table, so far from Evan that I would have needed to shout to have a conversation with him. Not that conversation was encouraged. Vanessa controlled everything, the seating arrangement, the topics we discussed, even the pace at which dishes were served. She had this way of smiling while she cut people off, of laughing while she dismissed whatever you just said. My son had married her 12 years ago, and somewhere in those 12 years he had stopped being my son and started being her echo. Sophie sat across from me, my 16-year-old granddaughter, the only spot of genuine light in that cold room. She kept glancing at me throughout dinner, small apologetic looks that told me she saw what was happening, even if no one else acknowledged it. I smiled at her and tried to focus on the food, tried to tell myself that family is complicated, that I should be grateful to be included at all. Then I reached for my wine glass, and my hand, the hand that used to sign contracts and shake hands with senators, the hand that built a life and buried a wife, that hand trembled just slightly. The glass tipped. Red wine spread across the white tablecloth like a wound. The table went silent. I grabbed my napkin immediately, pressing it against the stain, already apologizing. But Vanessa was faster. She let out this sigh, this theatrical exhale of disappointment, and then she said the words I will never forget as long as I live. This is exactly why I told Evan we cannot have you living with us. You are becoming, well, let us be honest, Walter. You are trash. Trash that needs to be taken out. I looked at my son, my only child. The boy I taught to ride a bicycle, the young man I walked through his first heartbreak. The adult I gave half my savings to when he wanted to start his own business. I looked at him and waited for him to say something. Anything. Evan laughed. A nervous, weak little laugh, the kind of sound a man makes when he has already surrendered and does not want anyone to notice. Sophie's fork clattered against her plate. Her face had gone pale. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I'd spent 69 years learning that some moments require stillness, not storm. I wiped my hands slowly on my napkin, folded it neatly beside my plate, and stood up. I put on my coat while they watched all of them frozen in their expensive chairs in their expensive dining room. Then I looked directly at Vanessa, and I spoke quietly enough that she had to lean forward to hear me. Vanessa, I want you to remember this moment. Remember exactly what you said and how you said it. One day, very soon, you will understand why. I walked to the door. As I paused with my hand on the handle, I caught Vanessa's reflection in the hallway mirror. She was staring at me with a strange expression, like she had seen something in my eyes she did not expect. Not hurt, not defeat. Something else entirely, something that looked like patience. I stepped out into the snow and closed the door behind me. I did not go home that night. Instead, I drove 30 miles through the falling snow, past the town where I had lived my whole life, past the cemetery where Margaret was buried until I reached a storage facility on the edge of the county. I had not been there in 6 years, not since the week after her funeral. But Margaret had left something for me in that place, something she told me to open only when I was ready. That Christmas night, with my daughter-in-law's words still ringing in my ears and my son's laughter still burning in my chest, I was finally ready. The storage facility sat at the edge of town, like a forgotten secret rows of metal doors, holding pieces of lives that people were not ready to let go of but could not bear to keep close. I had paid the monthly fee for 6 years without ever coming back, without ever finding the courage to face what Margaret had left behind. But courage is a strange thing. Sometimes it comes not from strength, but from having nothing left to lose. I pulled my car into the empty lot and sat for a moment watching the snow fall through my headlights. The cold seeped through the windows, but I barely felt it. Vanessa's words were still echoing in my skull, and beneath them, even worse, was the sound of my son's laugh. That weak, cowardly laugh that told me everything I needed to know about what my family had become while I was busy being invisible. The unit was number 47, halfway down the third row. Margaret had rented it herself years before she got sick, and she had made me promise never to go through it until I was ready. I asked her once what that meant, what ready would feel like. She just smiled that knowing smile of hers and said I would know when the time came. She was right. She was always right. The lock was stiff from years of disuse, but it gave way eventually, and I rolled up the metal door to reveal a space I had never fully explored. Boxes lined the walls, neatly labeled in Margaret's handwriting. Photos, letters, tax documents from the 80s. A box simply marked Evan Baby Years. And there, sitting on a small wooden table in the center of the unit like it had been waiting for me, was a folder with my name on it. For Walter, when you are ready. I didn't open it immediately. Instead, I stood there in that cold metal room surrounded by the artifacts of a life I had shared with the only woman who ever truly saw me, and I let the memories come. Margaret and I met when I was 24. Nobody with a dream of starting my own manufacturing business, and absolutely no idea how to make it happen. She was a secretary at a law firm downtown, sharp as a blade and twice as precise. She saw something in me that I could not see in myself, and she spent the next 40 years proving that her faith was not misplaced. When the banks laughed at my loan applications, she found private investors. When my first 2 business ventures failed, she sat with me at the kitchen table and helped me figure out what went wrong. When the third one finally succeeded, she never once said I told you so. She just smiled and asked what we were going to build next. By the time I was 50, Brooks Manufacturing employed 200 people and had contracts with companies across the Midwest. I was not wealthy by any extravagant measure, but I was respected. I had built something real, something that mattered. And then Margaret got sick. The diagnosis came like a thief in the night. Stage 3 breast cancer, aggressive and spreading. The doctors gave her odds that no husband should ever have to hear. But Margaret, my Margaret, she looked at those odds and laughed. She said she had beaten worse, and she planned to beat this too. She almost did. I sold the company within 6 months of her diagnosis. My accountant thought I was insane. My lawyer begged me to reconsider. Even Evan, in one of our rare honest conversations, asked me if I was sure. But I was sure. I had spent 30 years building a business, and I would spend whatever time I had left building something more important every possible moment with my wife. The money from the sale was more than enough to cover her treatments, our living expenses, and still leave a comfortable inheritance for Evan. I set up a trust fund to protect it, made sure everything was in order, and then I stepped back from the world. I stopped going to industry events. I stopped taking calls from old colleagues. I let myself become what everyone seemed to want me to be, just a quiet, retired old man with nothing to offer but his presence at holiday dinners. The family got used to it faster than I expected. Vanessa especially seemed relieved that I no longer talked about business or offered opinions about finances. Evan stopped asking for advice and started treating me like a guest. Even Sophie, young as she was, began to look at me with that particular softness people reserve for the elderly and the harmless. I let them believe it. I let them all believe that selling my company had somehow sold my mind along with it. Margaret knew better. She always knew better. I finally reached for the folder and opened it. Inside were documents I recognized, deeds and account statements and legal papers, but there was also a handwritten note on top, Margaret's elegant script filling the page. "My dearest Walter," it began. "If you are reading this, then something has happened that made you need answers. I wish I could be there to give them to you in person, but since I cannot, I have done the next best thing. I have prepared. Call Judith Parker. She is a lawyer, an old friend from my days at the firm, and she knows everything. I've trusted her with documents and instructions that will make sense when the time is right. And Walter, find Leonard Foster. He promised me he would watch over you, even if you never knew it. He owes you a debt he has never forgotten, and he has been keeping records that you will need." I read the note 3 times, trying to understand. Leonard Foster. I had not spoken to him in nearly 20 years, not since I helped him save his business from bankruptcy with a quiet investment that I never expected to see returned. And Judith Parker. I remembered her vaguely, a sharp-eyed woman who had attended our wedding and sent flowers when Margaret passed. Margaret had been planning something. Even as she was dying, even as I thought I was the one taking care of her, she had been taking care of me. At the bottom of the box beneath the folder and the documents and the memories, I found one more envelope. It was sealed with wax, old-fashioned and deliberate, and on the front were 2 words in Margaret's handwriting, "Trust no one." I broke the seal and pulled out a single sheet of paper. On it was a name I had not heard in years, a name connected to my son's marriage, to Vanessa's past, to secrets I had never thought to uncover. And beneath the name was a plan detailed and precise that my wife had set in motion before she ever took her final breath. Margaret had seen the danger coming long before I did, and she had made sure I would not face it alone. I sat in that storage unit until nearly dawn, reading through Margaret's documents and letting the truth settle into my bones. But the truth was not new to me. It was simply confirmation of what I had suspected for years. Validation of a quiet war I had been fighting in silence while everyone around me assumed I had already surrendered. The memory of Evan and Vanessa's wedding still lives in my mind with perfect clarity. 12 years ago, a beautiful June afternoon, white flowers everywhere and champagne flowing like promises. I stood next to Margaret as we watched our son exchange vows with a woman we barely knew. A woman who had swept into his life like a summer storm and convinced him to propose within 8 months of their first date. I thought it was romantic. Margaret thought it was calculated. She leaned close to me during the reception, her lips barely moving as she whispered words I would never forget. "That woman has hunger in her eyes, Walter. Not for love, for control. Watch her carefully." I dismissed it then. I told myself Margaret was being overprotective, that she would have found fault with any woman Evan chose, because no one would ever be good enough for her only son. I told myself to give Vanessa a chance to welcome her into our family with open arms and an open heart. It took 3 years for me to see what Margaret had seen in 3 seconds. The signs were subtle at first. Evan stopped calling his college friends. He missed his high school reunion because Vanessa had scheduled a spa weekend. He started deferring to her on every decision, from what car to buy to where to spend holidays. I watched my confident, independent son slowly transform into a man who checked his wife's expression before answering simple questions. And I watched Vanessa smile sweetly while she tightened her grip on everything he was. The financial control came next. Joint accounts became her accounts. Investment decisions required her approval. When Evan wanted to start a small business on the side, Vanessa convinced him it was too risky and redirected the money into renovations for their house instead. By year 5 of the marriage, my son did not make a single financial move without his wife's permission. Then she started on me. It began with small exclusions, family dinners where I learned about plans that had already been made without my input, holidays where my role shifted from patriarch to guest, phone calls with Evan that grew shorter and less frequent because Vanessa always seemed to need him for something the moment we started talking. She never said anything directly cruel, not in those early years. She simply made me irrelevant one small cut at a time until my absence from their lives felt more natural than my presence. I could have fought back. I could have confronted her, demanded my son choose between us, forced the issue into the open. But I had learned something valuable in 30 years of business. The best way to see a predator's true nature is to let them think the prey is already dead. So I retreated. I stopped offering opinions about their finances. I stopped visiting without calling first. I stopped asking questions about decisions that had clearly already been made. I let myself become exactly what Vanessa wanted me to be, a harmless old man with no power, no influence, and no threat. I played the role so well that even Evan started to believe it. But I never stopped watching, and I never stopped preparing. Margaret knew what I was doing. In her final weeks, when the cancer had taken almost everything but her mind remained sharp as ever, she made me promise two things. First, protect Sophie at all costs. Our granddaughter was the only innocent in this story, and she deserved better than to be raised by a woman who saw people as tools to be used. Second, never let Vanessa take everything without a fight. She will come for the money eventually, Margaret told me, her hand cold in mine, but her grip still fierce. When she does, you will be ready. I promised her both things, and I have spent 6 years keeping those promises. The Christmas dinner was not a breaking point for me. It was a signal. For 12 years, Vanessa had been careful to maintain her mask in front of witnesses to save her cruelty for private moments and quiet undermining. But calling me trash in front of Sophie, in front of Evan, with that smug certainty that no one would challenge her, that was the overreach I'd been waiting for. She had finally shown her true face in a room full of people who could not pretend they had not seen it. Now I could act without looking like the aggressor. Now I could protect what mattered without anyone accusing me of starting a war. Vanessa thought she was winning a game she had been playing for 12 years. She thought the helpless old man she had dismissed and diminished was exactly what he appeared to be. She did not realize I had been playing a different game entirely, a longer game, a game my wife had helped me design before she ever left this world. And I had already seen Vanessa's final move before she ever made it. To understand your enemy, you must first understand what made them. I learned that lesson decades ago in business, and I applied it to Vanessa the moment I realized what she truly was. Margaret's documents gave me facts and figures, but the real education came from years of quiet observation, from listening when people thought I was too old to hear, from piecing together a story that Vanessa herself had probably never told anyone in full. Her mother's name was Brenda, and Brenda's story was the key to everything. I learned the details gradually. Fragments gathered from overheard phone calls and careless comments Vanessa made when she thought I was not paying attention. Brenda had married young, just 19 years old, to a man from a wealthy family who promised her the world. She gave him 20 years of her life, raised his children, managed his household, played the perfect wife at every company function and family gathering. Then he died suddenly of a heart attack at 47, and Brenda discovered that perfect wives get nothing when the money belongs to the husband's family. His parents swooped in like vultures before the funeral flowers had wilted. The house was in a family trust. The investments were structured to bypass her entirely. The life insurance went to accounts she had no access to. After 2 decades of marriage, Brenda walked away with her clothes, her jewelry, and a bitterness that would poison everything she touched for the rest of her life. She raised Vanessa on that bitterness. She taught her daughter that love was a transaction, that marriage was a battlefield, and that the only way to survive was to control the money before someone else controlled you. Never let them hold the purse strings, Brenda would say, according to the scraps of conversation I overheard over the years. In marriage, the one who controls the finances controls everything. Your father's family took everything from me. Never let that happen to you. Vanessa learned her lessons well. I watched her apply those lessons to my son with surgical precision over 12 years of marriage. It started small, the way these things always do. Joint accounts that somehow became accounts only she managed. Investment decisions that required her signature because she was better with money, and Evan should not have to worry about such things. Bills that went to her email address, passwords that only she knew. By the 5th year, Evan could not have told you how much money they had if you had asked him directly. By the 10th year, he had stopped thinking about finances entirely because Vanessa handled everything. I documented all of it. Every shifted account, every transferred asset, every small step in her systematic takeover. I kept records the way I had kept records in business, methodical and thorough, because I knew that someday the documentation would matter more than my word. Then, 18 months ago, Vanessa made her fatal mistake. She convinced Evan to sign a power of attorney. I learned about it only because Sophie mentioned it casually during one of our phone calls. Mom had Dad sign some legal papers. She said something about making it easier to handle money stuff. Sophie did not think anything of it, neither did Evan apparently. He signed where Vanessa pointed and never bothered to read the fine print. But I read it. I obtained a copy through channels Margaret had established years ago, and I read every word. The document gave Vanessa complete control over Evan's financial decisions, including his role as beneficiary of the trust fund I had established when I sold my company. She could now make decisions about that money without Evan's direct involvement. She could access accounts, redirect funds, make transfers, all with the stroke of a pen. What Vanessa did not know, what she could not have known, because she never bothered to research the legal structures she was trying to manipulate, was that her power of attorney had triggered a clause in my trust. Any unauthorized third-party control over a beneficiary's financial rights required trustee notification and approval. She had never sought my approval because she assumed I was too senile to understand what she was doing. That assumption would cost her everything. The night of the Christmas dinner, after I had walked out into the snow, Vanessa called her mother. I know this because Sophie told me later, having overheard the conversation from the hallway. Vanessa was laughing triumphant, bragging about finally putting the old man in his place. And Brenda, that bitter woman who had taught her daughter to see family as enemies and love as leverage, laughed right along with her. "Good girl," Brenda said. "The old ones always think they deserve respect just for being old. Make sure you get his house in your name before he dies." They laughed together, mother and daughter, celebrating what they believed was a victory. Vanessa thought she had built an unbreakable kingdom over 12 years of careful manipulation. She thought she had eliminated every threat, neutralized, every opponent secured, every asset. But every kingdom has a weakness, a single crack in the foundation that brings the whole structure down. Hers was a piece of paper she had convinced her husband to sign without reading a document she thought gave her power, but actually gave me proof. I returned home from the storage unit as the sun was rising, but sleep would not come. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, and no matter how many times I tried to focus on Vanessa and her schemes, my mind kept returning to the same image, not her face when she called me trash, not her smug satisfaction as I walked out the door. No, the image that burned behind my eyes was my son's face, that nervous laugh, that complete and utter failure to be a son when his father needed him most. I have replayed the Christmas dinner 100 times since that night, examining every detail like evidence in a trial. Vanessa's cruelty was expected. I had watched her sharpen that blade for 12 years, and I knew eventually she would use it openly. But Evan's response, or rather his complete lack of response, that was the wound that would not stop bleeding. His father had just been called trash, garbage, something to be thrown away and forgotten. And my son, my only child, the boy I had sacrificed my company to care for, the man I had supported through every failure and celebrated through every success, that man heard those words and laughed. Not a shocked laugh, not an uncomfortable laugh that might precede a defense. A nervous, complicit laugh. The laugh of a man who has chosen his side and wants everyone to know it without having to say the words out loud. I spent the dark hours before dawn cataloging other moments, other betrayals, building a case against my own son in the court of my broken heart. 3 years ago, on the first anniversary of Margaret's death, I planned a small memorial dinner. Just family, just remembrance, just one evening to honor the woman who had held us all together. I called Evan 2 weeks in advance. I reminded him a week before. I confirmed the day before. And on the evening itself, 30 minutes before he was supposed to arrive, he texted me. "Vanessa has a work thing. Cannot make it. Sorry, Dad. A work thing." On the anniversary of his mother's death, he chose a work thing. Then there were the birthdays. My 67th, 68th. 8th, 69th. 3 years in a row, not a single call. I would receive a text message sometime in the following week, always the same hollow words. "Sorry I missed it, Dad. Things have been crazy. Let us get lunch soon. We never got lunch. He never called. The only time my phone rang with his name on the screen was when he needed something money for a home repair advice on a tax situation. a signature on some document Vanessa required. I became a resource to my son, not a father. Something to be accessed when useful and ignored when not. But there was one memory that did not fit the pattern one moment I kept returning to because it refused to make sense alongside all the others. 3 years ago, maybe 4 months after the memorial dinner, he missed Evan showed up at my house unannounced. This alone was remarkable because Evan never did anything without Vanessa's knowledge and approval, certainly not something as significant as visiting his father. He looked terrible, exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness, haunted by something he could not name. He sat at my kitchen table and wrapped his hands around a cup of coffee and stared at the steam rising from it like a man trying to find words that kept slipping away. "Dad," he finally said, "I need to tell you something. I need you to know that His phone rang. Vanessa's ringtone, that sharp electronic chirp I had learned to recognize over the years. Evan's face changed in an instant. The exhaustion gave way to something else, something that looked almost like fear. He answered the call, spoke in monosyllables, and was out of my house within 2 minutes. I never learned what he wanted to tell me. He never brought it up again, and whenever I tried to ask, he changed the subject with the desperation of a man avoiding a wound that had not yet healed. I filed that memory away and kept watching. At the Christmas dinner before the wine spill and the insult, Vanessa had mentioned divorce casually. She was talking about a colleague whose marriage was ending, and she said the word lightly, carelessly, like it meant nothing. But I saw Evan flinch. A small movement quickly suppressed the kind of involuntary response that comes from muscle memory. His shoulders tightened, his jaw clenched, his eyes dropped to his plate. And then it was over so fast that anyone not watching closely would have missed it entirely. But I was watching. I am always watching. A man who flinches at a word has been wounded by it before. That is something I learned in 30 years of business negotiations, reading the small betrayals of body language that people cannot control. Evan flinched at the word divorce the way a man flinches at the name of someone who once hurt him deeply. That word had power over my son. That word was a weapon someone had used against him probably more than once. I had spent months hating Evan for his weakness. I had built a fortress of righteous anger around the simple fact that my son had failed to defend me when I needed him most. But lying awake in those dark hours after Christmas, turning the evidence over in my mind like stones in a riverbed, I began to wonder if I had been asking the wrong questions. What if Evan's silence was not cowardice? What if it was surrender? The kind of surrender that comes only after you have already lost something you could not afford to lose. What had Vanessa taken from my son that made him so afraid to defy her? What had she threatened? What had she already destroyed? The questions about Evan haunted me through the weeks that followed Christmas, but I did not let them slow my preparations. Whatever chains Vanessa had wrapped around my son, whatever threats she held over his head, the path forward remained the same. I had promised Margaret I would protect Sophie and never let Vanessa take everything without a fight. Those promises did not change based on whether my son was a coward or a captive. January crept forward with the slow patience of winter. I met with Judith Parker in her small office downtown, reviewing the documents Margaret had prepared, confirming that every legal mechanism was in place. I spoke with Leonard Foster by phone, listening as he walked me through 5 years of meticulous records. And I waited because the trap Vanessa had set for herself required nothing from me but patience. She had signed the documents. She had filed the power of attorney. She had triggered the clause in the trust without ever knowing it existed. All I had to do was let the system Margaret had designed do its work. The call came on January 15th at 2 a.m. I was not asleep. I had not slept well since Christmas, my mind too busy cataloging evidence and planning contingencies to allow for rest. When my phone lit up with Evan's name, I felt something shift in my chest. Not triumph, something quieter, something almost like grief for what was about to happen. I answered on the 3rd ring. "Dad." Evan's voice was shaking, barely controlled panic bleeding through every syllable. "Dad, something is wrong. Something is really wrong. Our accounts, all of them, everything is frozen. Credit cards declined. Bank account locked. I cannot access anything. Vanessa is losing her mind. What is happening? Do you know what is happening?" I could hear Vanessa in the background, her voice sharp and hysterical, demanding answers that Evan did not have. I let the silence stretch for a moment, letting my son sit with his fear, letting the weight of the situation settle into his bones. "Evan," I said calmly, almost gently, "do you remember what you signed 18 months ago? The power of attorney." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. Even Vanessa's screaming faded into the background as Evan processed the question. "The power of attorney," I continued. "The document Vanessa convinced you to sign so she could handle your financial decisions. Do you remember that I—" Yes, I remember. But what does that have to do with— Check the terms of your mother's trust fund, Section 12, Paragraph 3. Then call me back." I ended the call before he could respond. Some lessons need to be learned in silence. I imagined the scene that followed because Sophie described pieces of it to me later. Evan standing frozen in the middle of the bedroom, phone in hand, while Vanessa tore through filing cabinets looking for documents she had never bothered to read carefully. The trust fund paperwork had been in their possession for years, filed away and forgotten because Vanessa assumed she already understood everything important about it. She was wrong. Section 12, Paragraph 3. I had memorized those words years ago when Margaret first showed me the trust she had designed with Judith's help. The language was precise, deliberate, crafted specifically for the situation we now found ourselves in. Any transfer of financial authority from the primary beneficiary to a third party without explicit trustee consent shall constitute a violation of fiduciary duty, resulting in immediate suspension of all distributed assets pending legal review. Vanessa had transferred financial authority to herself through the power of attorney. She had done it without trustee consent because she never bothered to ask. She assumed the trustee was a senile old man who did not understand money, who could be ignored and bypassed and dismissed. She had assured Evan of this many times over the years, convincing him that his father's role as trustee was purely ceremonial, a meaningless title attached to an empty mind. She was catastrophically wrong. The trust Margaret created was not a simple inheritance vehicle. It was a fortress designed by a woman who had spent years watching Vanessa and preparing for exactly this scenario. The moment Vanessa filed that power of attorney, she triggered an automatic review process. The moment the review confirmed unauthorized third-party control, the assets froze. Not because I pushed a button or made a phone call, but because Vanessa herself had activated the trap by reaching too far too fast, too greedily. My phone rang again 20 minutes later. This time it was not Evan's voice I heard first. It was Vanessa's screaming in the background with a fury I had never heard from her before. The composed, controlled woman who had called me trash at Christmas dinner was gone. In her place was something raw and desperate and afraid. Evan came on the line, his voice hollow. "Dad, the trustee's signature on these documents. It is your name. You are the trustee. You have been the trustee this whole time." "Yes," I said simply. Vanessa grabbed the phone from him. I could hear her breathing ragged and sharp, trying to compose herself enough to form words. "You," she hissed. "You planned this. You trapped us." "No, Vanessa. I did not trap anyone. You triggered a clause that has existed since before you married my son. You filed documents without reading the fine print. You assumed I was too old and too stupid to matter. Everything that is happening right now is the direct consequence of your own actions. I did not have to do anything except wait for you to overreach." The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had heard in years. Then Vanessa screamed, not words, just pure rage and fear, and the sound of a kingdom crumbling. And somewhere in that scream I heard her finally understand that the senile old man she had dismissed for 12 years had been watching her every move, waiting for exactly this moment. The morning after Vanessa's screaming phone call, I drove to a small law office on the quieter side of town, a place I had visited only once before, 6 years ago, when Margaret was still alive and planning for a future she knew she would not see. Judith Parker was waiting for me at the door, and when she saw my face, she smiled, the knowing smile of a woman who had been expecting this moment for a very long time. She was 64 years old, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of calm authority that comes from decades of navigating legal battles and human weakness. Margaret had met her 40 years ago when they both worked at the same law firm downtown Margaret as a secretary, and Judith as a young associate fighting to prove herself in a profession that did not welcome women easily. They had remained friends through all the years that followed, through marriages and children and careers and loss. When Margaret needed someone to help her build a fortress around her family's future, Judith was the only person she trusted with the blueprints. "Come in," Walter, Judith said, gesturing toward her private office. "We have a great deal to discuss, and I've been waiting 6 years to have this conversation." Her office was modest, but organized, every file in its place, every surface clean and purposeful. She closed the door behind us and moved to a filing cabinet in the corner, withdrawing a thick folder with a label I recognized immediately. Brooks Family Protection Plan. Margaret's handwriting. Margaret's foresight. Margaret's love translated into legal language and binding documents. Judith sat across from me and opened the folder with the reverence of someone handling something precious. "Your wife came to me 8 years ago," she began, "right after her diagnosis. She knew she might not survive, and she was terrified. Not of dying, Walter. Margaret was never afraid of death. She was terrified of what would happen to you and to Sophie after she was gone. She had been watching Vanessa for years by then, and she saw exactly what that woman was building. So she asked me to help her build something stronger." Judith explained the trust in terms I could follow, though I suspect she simplified considerably for my benefit. Margaret had created what lawyers call a dynasty trust, a structure designed to protect family wealth across generations while preventing any single person from seizing control. The key innovation was something Judith called an elder protection clause, a provision Margaret had insisted upon even though it was unusual and complicated to implement. "The trust works like this," Judith said, leaning forward to ensure I understood. "The family wealth flows through you as trustee, then passes to Evan as the primary beneficiary. But there are conditions, strict conditions. If any third party gains unauthorized financial control over the beneficiary, meaning, if someone like Vanessa manipulates Evan into signing over his financial authority without your explicit consent as trustee, the trust automatically freezes all distributed assets pending legal review." She paused to let that sink in. The moment Vanessa filed that power of attorney 18 months ago, she violated the trust terms. She didn't know it because she never consulted you, never sought trustee approval, never imagined that the old man she had been dismissing for years actually held the keys to the kingdom. The money is not gone, Walter. It is simply locked until we resolve this legally, and we will resolve it, I promise you that. I sat in silence for a moment, overwhelmed by the scope of what Margaret had built. She had seen this coming more than half a decade before it happened. She had constructed a legal fortress brick by brick while she was dying, while I thought I was the one taking care of her. She had protected me even as I held her hand and watched her fade. Judith reached into the folder and withdrew a sealed envelope smaller than the others with my name written on the front in Margaret's elegant script. "She asked me to give you this when the time came," Judith said softly. "I have not read it. No one has. It was meant only for you." My hands trembled as I took the envelope. The paper was slightly yellowed with age, the seal unbroken after 6 years of waiting. I opened it carefully as if the letter itself might dissolve if I moved too quickly, and I unfolded the single page inside. "My dearest Walter." The letter began, and I could hear her voice in every word. "If you are reading this, then Vanessa finally showed her hand. I'm sorry I could not protect you myself. I'm sorry I had to leave you to face her alone. But you were never truly alone, my love. I knew Judith would be there when you needed legal armor. I knew Leonard would keep watch when you could not. And I knew you would find the strength to fight when the time came because you have always been stronger than you believed. You were never weak, Walter. You were patient. And patience is the most dangerous weapon of all. Now it is time to stop waiting. Set your boundaries. Protect our Sophie. And remember that kindness without boundaries is simply an invitation to be used. I love you. I will always love you. Margaret." I read the letter 3 times, her handwriting blurring through my tears. 6 years she had been gone, and she was still protecting me, still guiding me, still loving me from wherever souls go when they leave this world. Judith waited until I had composed myself before speaking again. "There is one more thing," she said gently. "Your wife asked Leonard Foster to keep an eye on Vanessa after she passed. He's been documenting everything for 5 years, Walter. Financial irregularities, suspicious transfers, conversations with business associates. He has built a case file that would make any prosecutor weep with joy. He is ready to help whenever you need him." I folded Margaret's letter carefully and tucked it into my jacket pocket close to my heart where it belonged. My wife had been dead for 6 years, but she had given me more than memories. She had given me an army. 2 days after my meeting with Judith, a knock came at my front door. I was not expecting visitors, and for a moment I considered ignoring it, retreating deeper into the quiet solitude that had become my natural state over the past 6 years. But something made me rise from my chair and cross the living room, some instinct that told me this knock was different from the others. Leonard Foster stood on my porch, 71 years old, and looking every day of it, his silver hair windswept and his face lined with the kind of weariness that comes from carrying heavy secrets for too long. In his hands he held a thick folder, edges worn from years of handling, and when our eyes met, I saw something I'd not expected. Relief. The relief of a man finally able to set down a burden he had been carrying alone. "Walter," he said simply, "it is time we talked." I had not spoken properly to Leonard in nearly 2 decades. We had exchanged Christmas cards, brief phone calls on birthdays, the polite maintenance of a friendship that had once been much deeper. I knew he had rebuilt his business after the crisis that nearly destroyed him. I knew his children had grown and moved away. But I did not know until that moment on my porch that he had been watching over me all along. I invited him in and made coffee, and we sat at my kitchen table the way we used to sit 30 years ago. When we were both younger and the world seemed full of problems we could solve together. Leonard placed his folder on the table between us, but didn't open it immediately. Instead, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Margaret called me a week before she died," he said quietly. "She knew she was running out of time and she had one last request. She made me promise to watch Vanessa, to document everything I saw, to keep records that might be needed someday. I have been keeping that promise for 5 years, Walter. Everything is in here." He pushed the folder toward me, and I felt the weight of it before I even touched it. 5 years of observations, 5 years of evidence, 5 years of a dead woman's foresight being carried out by a man who owed her nothing except gratitude for the husband she had loved. I asked him why. Not why he had done it, but why Margaret had asked him specifically. Leonard smiled sadly and leaned back in his chair. "You saved my life, Walter. 20 years ago when everything was falling apart. Do you remember?" I remembered. It was not something I thought about often, but the memory surfaced easily when he mentioned it. Leonard's manufacturing business had been struggling for years, squeezed by larger competitors and bleeding money faster than he could stop it. He was 3 months from bankruptcy, about to lose not just his company but his home, his retirement, everything he had built over a lifetime of work. His wife was sick, his children were in college, he had nowhere to turn. I gave him the money he needed, not a loan, not an investment with strings attached, just a check written from my personal savings because I believed in him, and because I could not stand by and watch a good man drown when I had the means to throw him a rope. I asked for nothing in return. I told him to pay me back if he could when he could, and if he never could, that would be fine too. He paid me back within 5 years, every penny plus interest I had never requested, but the debt he felt he owed went far beyond money. "You gave me back my life," Leonard said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave me back my family's future. Margaret knew I would do anything to repay that debt, so when she asked me to watch, I watched. When she asked me to document, I documented, and now everything I have gathered is yours." He opened the folder and began spreading its contents across my kitchen table. The scope of what he had compiled took my breath away. Dates and times when Vanessa had moved money between accounts without Evan's knowledge, records of luxury purchases, designer bags and jewelry, and spa retreats hidden from family accounting through a web of separate credit cards. Emails obtained legally through Business Associates Communications, in which Vanessa discussed her plans to secure assets before the old man is referring to me with the casual cruelty of someone who had already written my obituary in her mind. There was more. Testimony from a former financial advisor who had quit working with Vanessa because of what he called unethical requests. Bank statements showing patterns of transfers that made no sense unless you understood they were designed to obscure their true purpose. A timeline of every major financial decision in Evan and Vanessa's marriage, annotated with Leonard's observations about who had actually made each choice. 5 years of evidence, 5 years of proof, 5 years of a trap being built around a woman who never knew she was being watched. Leonard sat back and let me absorb it all. Then he mentioned something that made me stop cold. "There is one more thing," he said carefully. "About 3 months ago, I received a phone call from your granddaughter, Sophie. She said she was working on a school project about elder rights and financial abuse. She asked me very specific questions about how to document suspicious financial activity, what kind of evidence holds up in legal proceedings, how to protect elderly family members from exploitation. Very specific questions, Walter. The kind of questions a 16-year-old does not usually ask unless she has a reason. My eyes narrowed. Sophie. My quiet, watchful granddaughter who always seemed to see more than she said. The girl who had frozen at the Christmas table when Vanessa called me trash, who had texted me the next day to apologize for not speaking up, who had been asking Leonard Foster about documenting financial abuse. Sophie knew more than she had shown. Sophie had been preparing just like her grandmother, just like Leonard, just like me. I looked at the evidence spread across my kitchen table, every lie and scheme and betrayal documented in neat handwriting, and I understood what Margaret had truly built. Not just a fortress, not just an army. She had planted seeds in everyone who loved me, seeds that had been growing in silence for years, waiting for the moment when they would all bloom at once. Margaret had given me Judith for legal protection. She had given me Leonard for evidence. And now it seemed she had somehow reached across death itself to prepare Sophie for a role none of us had anticipated. I needed one more soldier, and she was 16 years old. I underestimated Vanessa's capacity for destruction. That was my mistake, and I own it. I knew she was dangerous. I knew she was manipulative, but I did not fully appreciate how vicious a cornered animal could become until she launched her counterattack. It began within days of the frozen accounts. Vanessa hired the most aggressive attorney in the county, a man named Richards, whose reputation for ruthless litigation preceded him like a warning siren. She was not interested in negotiation or settlement. She wanted war, and she wanted to make sure everyone knew that Walter Brooks, the senile old man who had somehow frozen her family's finances, was the villain of this story. The smear campaign started on social media. Vanessa posted long emotional messages about the pain of dealing with toxic elderly relatives who think they can control everyone around them. She did not name me directly, but she did not need to. Anyone who knew our family understood exactly who she meant. She painted herself as a devoted wife and mother, trying to protect her family from a bitter, mentally unstable father-in-law who could not accept that his son had grown up and moved on. The comments poured in dozens of sympathetic responses from people who had never met me, validating her victimhood and condemning the monster she had invented. She called relatives I had not spoken to in years, feeding them stories about my erratic behavior, my obsession with money, my jealousy of Evan's success. She contacted old business associates and suggested with carefully crafted concern that my mental faculties had been declining for some time. She was building a narrative in which she was the innocent victim and I was the deranged aggressor. And she was building it fast enough that by the time the truth came out, the damage might already be done. But her cruelest move was saved for Sophie. I learned about it later, pieced together from fragments Sophie shared and observations Leonard gathered through his network. Vanessa sat Sophie down in their living room and told her with tears streaming down her face that her grandfather was trying to destroy their family. "He wants to take away everything your father worked for," Vanessa said. "He is bitter and angry, and he cannot stand to see us happy. If you talk to him, if you contact him in any way, you are choosing him over your own parents. Is that what you want? Sophie, to tear your family apart for a confused old man who does not even remember what he had for breakfast?" Sophie went quiet after that conversation. She stopped texting me. She stopped calling. When I tried to reach her, my messages went unanswered. For a terrible week, I thought Vanessa had won, that she had turned my granddaughter against me with her poison words and manufactured tears. I didn't know then what Sophie was really doing with her silence. Evan, meanwhile, was being torn apart from both sides. Vanessa demanded that he publicly condemn me, that he post on social media supporting her narrative, that he call relatives and confirm her version of events. She wanted him to choose loudly and permanently in front of everyone who mattered. For the first time in years, Evan hesitated. "He is still my father, Vanessa," he said. "I heard about this conversation from Leonard, who had heard it from a friend of a friend who worked in their neighborhood. I cannot just publicly destroy him." Vanessa's response was ice. "And I am still the mother of your child. Choose wisely." Evan fell silent. He remembered, I am certain, the last time Vanessa had given him that ultimatum. He remembered what she had threatened, what she had taken, what she had made him sacrifice to keep his daughter in his life. The threat worked as it always did. Evan did not publicly condemn me, but he did not defend me either. He retreated into the silence that had become his natural state, a man trapped between two impossible choices. I could have ended it then. I had Leonard's evidence, 5 years of documented proof that would expose Vanessa's lies and manipulations to anyone willing to look. I could have released it all gone public with the emails and bank statements, and witness testimony destroyed her credibility before she destroyed mine. Judith counseled patience. Let her make more mistakes, she advised during one of our strategy sessions. The angrier she gets, the more she will reveal. Every social media post, every phone call, every lie she tells is another piece of evidence for our case. Let her hang herself with her own rope. I agreed, but not for strategic reasons. I agreed because of Sophie. Whatever was happening in that house, whatever game Vanessa was playing with our family's future, my granddaughter was caught in the middle of it. I would not turn this into a public spectacle that she would have to witness a war fought in headlines and comment sections while she tried to survive her junior year of high school. So I waited. I let Vanessa rage and lie and manipulate. I let her think she was winning. She was so busy fighting her war that she never noticed what was happening right under her own roof. She did not notice that her daughter had not spoken a voluntary word in weeks. She did not notice that Sophie's phone was always in her hand, always recording, capturing every tearful manipulation and whispered threat. And she certainly did not notice the folder hidden under Sophie's mattress, a folder labeled evidence in neat handwriting growing thicker with each passing day. Vanessa was fighting like a cornered animal, loud and vicious and desperate. She didn't realize that the quietest person in her house was the most dangerous one of all. The text message arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after Vanessa's campaign against me had reached its peak. It came from a number I did not recognize, but the words made my heart stop. Grandpa. Coffee shop on Miller Street. Tomorrow 3. Come alone. Delete this message. Sophie. I barely slept that night. 1,000 possibilities ran through my mind, most of them dark. Had Vanessa discovered what I was planning? Was Sophie being used as bait? Was my granddaughter reaching out for help? Or had she been turned into another weapon against me? The coffee shop was small and quiet, tucked between a bookstore and a florist on a street I rarely visited. I arrived 15 minutes early and chose a table in the back corner where I could watch the door. When Sophie walked in, my breath caught in my throat. She looked older than 16. There was something in her eyes that I recognized, something I had seen in Margaret's eyes during the hardest years of our lives: determination, purpose, the quiet steel of someone who has made a decision and will not be moved from it. Sophie sat across from me without ordering anything. For a moment we just looked at each other, grandfather and granddaughter, separated by weeks of enforced silence, but connected by something deeper than Vanessa's manipulations could ever reach. Then Sophie reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. She slid it across the table toward me, and when I opened it, I understood that everything I thought I knew about my granddaughter had been incomplete. Grandpa, she said, her voice steady despite the nervousness I could see in her hands. I know what Mom is doing. I know what she has been doing for years, and I have proof. The folder was organized with a precision that would have made any lawyer proud. Dated entries, screenshots of text messages and emails, photographs of financial documents she had found in her mother's home office. Recordings, dozens of them captured on her phone during conversations Vanessa never suspected were being documented. 1 year of evidence gathered methodically by a teenage girl who had been watching, waiting, preparing. I looked up at Sophie, unable to speak, and she must have seen the question in my eyes, because she answered it before I could ask. Grandma talked to me before she died, Sophie said softly. I was 10 years old and she asked me to sit with her alone one afternoon. She told me things I did not fully understand then, but I remembered every word. She said that my mother was not a bad person, but she was scared, and scared people do terrible things. She said I should watch, learn, and when my grandfather needed help, I should be ready. Sophie's voice cracked slightly, but she pushed through. I started paying attention after that. I watched how Mom treated you. I watched how she controlled Dad. I watched how she manipulated everyone around her while smiling and pretending to be the perfect wife and mother. And when I turned 15, I started keeping records. I did not know what I would do with them. I just knew that someday, somehow, they would matter. I reached into my jacket and pulled out Margaret's letter, the one Judith had given me weeks ago. I had read it so many times that the creases were starting to wear thin, but I had never shared it with anyone. Now I unfolded it and placed it on the table between us. Your grandmother left me this, I said. I think you should read it. Sophie picked up the letter with trembling fingers. I watched her eyes move across Margaret's handwriting, watched her expression shift from curiosity to recognition to something that looked like grief and love intertwined. When she reached a particular line, tears began streaming down her face. Protect Sophie at all costs, she read aloud, her voice breaking. She is the only pure thing in that family. I reached across the table and took my granddaughter's hand. Your grandmother saw who you really are, I said. So do I. We sat in silence for a long moment, 2 generations, connected by a woman who had loved us both fiercely enough to plan for a future she would never see. Sophie wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders, and when she spoke again, her voice had steadied. I will help you, Grandpa. Everything in that folder is yours, but I have one condition. Anything. I want my dad to have a chance to choose differently. Before you destroy Mom, before everything becomes public, give him a chance to stand up. He is not evil. He is just lost. And I think if he sees that there is another way, he might find his courage again. Please. I looked at my granddaughter, this fierce, quiet, brilliant girl who had been preparing for battle since she was 15 years old. She had every reason to be angry, every justification for wanting vengeance. But instead of demanding destruction, she was asking for mercy. She was asking me to give her father one more chance to be the man he should have been all along. Margaret would have been so proud of her. I agree, I said. We will give Evan a chance, but if he chooses wrong. Sophie, if he stands with Vanessa after everything we show him, then we proceed without him. Agreed. Sophie nodded, relief flooding her features. Agreed. I looked at my granddaughter across that small coffee shop table, this young woman who carried her grandmother's wisdom and her grandfather's patience and something entirely her own that neither of us could have taught her. Margaret had left me more than a letter. She had left me a legacy. And that legacy was sitting across from me now, ready to fight for what was right, with her grandmother's eyes shining through her tears. Judith filed the lawsuit on a Monday morning in early March, timing it deliberately for maximum impact. She had spent weeks preparing the documents, cross-referencing Leonard's evidence, with Sophie's recordings building a case so comprehensive that even the most skeptical judge would have to take it seriously. When she walked into the civil courthouse and submitted the filing, she was not just initiating a legal proceeding. She was lighting a fuse that would burn through everything Vanessa had built. The charges were severe and specific: breach of fiduciary duty, financial elder abuse, fraud through deception. Each count was supported by documentation that stretched back years, a paper trail of manipulation that Vanessa had never imagined anyone was following. Leonard's 5 years of evidence formed the backbone, showing patterns of financial movement that made no sense unless you understood they were designed to consolidate control while hiding the consolidation. Sophie's recordings, legal under our state's one-party consent laws, provided the human element, capturing Vanessa's own voice, discussing her plans, her contempt for me, her strategies for ensuring that when I died, everything would already be in her name. The financial records were perhaps the most damning. Transfers that Evan had never authorized, bearing signatures that did not quite match his usual handwriting. Accounts opened without his knowledge. Investment decisions made in his name, but clearly orchestrated by someone else. The picture they painted was unmistakable. Vanessa had not just influenced her husband's finances, she had systematically taken control of them while maintaining the illusion that he was still in charge. Judith arranged for Vanessa to be served at her workplace. I did not witness it myself, but I heard the details later from multiple sources. The process server walked into the marketing firm where Vanessa had cultivated her professional reputation for over a decade, asked for her by name at the reception desk, and handed her the summons in full view of 3 colleagues and her direct supervisor. The color drained from her face as she read the first page. By the time she reached the list of charges, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the papers. In Vanessa's world, appearances were everything. She had built her entire identity around being seen as successful, sophisticated, in control. Being publicly served with a lawsuit alleging elder abuse and fraud was not just a legal problem. It was social annihilation. Within hours, whispers had spread through her office. Within days, her carefully constructed reputation had begun to crumble. But the most important development happened at home, away from the public spectacle. Evan finally read the evidence file. Sophie told me about it later, describing the scene in her father's home office late one evening. Evan had obtained a copy of the lawsuit documents, probably from Vanessa's own files, and he sat alone for hours going through every page. Sophie watched from the doorway as her father's expression shifted from skepticism to confusion to something that looked like a man waking from a very long sleep. He saw the bank transfers he had never authorized. He saw the emails in which his wife discussed getting rid of the old man's influence. He saw his own signature on documents he had no memory of signing approvals for financial decisions he had never been consulted about. For years, Evan had believed Vanessa when she told him that his father was paranoid, that I was exaggerating her behavior, that our conflict was simply a clash of personalities between a controlling old man and an independent daughter-in-law. Now he saw the truth in black and white. His wife had been lying to him. His wife had been manipulating him. His wife had been using his own signature to commit acts that he would never have approved if he had known what was happening. Sophie said he sat in silence for a long time after finishing the file. Then he put his head in his hands and wept. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. Vanessa's attorney, the aggressive Richard she had hired to destroy me, immediately filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial, that the recordings were obtained under false pretenses, that the entire case was a vindictive attack by a bitter family member. The judge reviewed the motion, reviewed our evidence, and denied the dismissal in less than 20 minutes. The evidence is substantial and well documented, she said from the bench. This case will proceed to a full hearing. For the first time in 12 years, Vanessa faced a fight she could not control. She could not charm the judge. She could not manipulate the evidence. She could not buy her way out of a paper trail that stretched back half a decade. The legal system did not care about her social standing or her professional reputation or the narrative she had been spinning on social media. It cared only about facts, and the facts were devastating. As Vanessa left the courthouse after the dismissal ruling, she passed me in the hallway. I was standing near the exit with Judith reviewing some documents, and for a moment our eyes met. I saw her searching my face for something, triumph perhaps, or gloating the satisfaction of a man who had finally gotten his revenge. Instead, she saw pity. I was not enjoying this. I took no pleasure in watching her world collapse, no joy in seeing the fear behind her eyes. I had wanted justice. I had wanted protection for my family. I had wanted accountability for years of manipulation and abuse. But I had never wanted to destroy another human being, not even one who had called me trash and tried to erase me from my own family. Vanessa saw that pity in my face, and something in her expression shifted. Hatred she could have understood, triumph she could have fought against. But pity, genuine pity from a man she had spent 12 years dismissing as worthless, that terrified her more than any threat ever could. Because pity meant I saw her clearly now. Not as a monster, but as something almost worse. A scared woman who had become exactly what she feared, and who had no one left to blame but herself. The weeks following the preliminary hearing were brutal for Vanessa, though I took no pleasure in watching her world collapse. News of the lawsuit spread through her social circles with the speed and devastation of wildfire. The same people who had liked her social media posts condemning toxic elderly relatives now distanced themselves with remarkable efficiency. Country club friends stopped returning her calls. Business partners who had once sought her advice suddenly found themselves too busy to meet. Dinner invitations dried up. Golf foursomes were rearranged without her. In Vanessa's world, reputation was currency, and she had just gone bankrupt. I learned most of this through Leonard, who had maintained his network of observers even as the legal battle intensified. He reported that Vanessa had been seen dining alone at restaurants where she once held court, that her colleagues at work had begun treating her with the careful politeness reserved for people who might soon be unemployed, that her name had become something whispered rather than spoken openly. The people who had validated her cruelty on social media were nowhere to be found now that cruelty had consequences. Even her own attorney turned against her, though, in a more pragmatic way. Richards called her into his office 3 weeks after the dismissal hearing and delivered advice she did not want to hear. The evidence is overwhelming, he told her flatly. Leonard's source reported the conversation in detail. If this goes to trial, you will not just lose the case. You will lose everything: your professional reputation, your standing in the community, possibly your freedom depending on how the judge interprets the elder abuse statutes. My strong recommendation is that you settle, negotiate the best terms you can, and walk away before this gets any worse. Vanessa refused. She was not yet ready to admit defeat, not yet willing to accept that the kingdom she had built could crumble so completely. But the cruelest abandonment came from her own mother. Brenda, who had taught Vanessa everything she knew about controlling money and manipulating family, stopped calling after learning the full scope of the lawsuit. Sophie overheard the final conversation between them. Vanessa pleading for support, for advice, for the maternal guidance she had relied on her entire life. Brenda's response was cold and final. "I told you to be smart," Brenda said. "I told you to secure everything before anyone noticed. I did not tell you to get caught. You are on your own now. Do not call me again until this is over." The line went dead. Vanessa stood in her kitchen holding a silent phone, and for the first time Sophie saw her mother look genuinely alone. Even predators, it seemed, abandoned their young when the hunt failed. Then Evan came to my house. It was late evening, well past the hour when casual visits occur. I was sitting in my living room reading when I heard a car pull into the driveway, headlights sweeping across the curtains. I looked out the window and saw my son's car, and I saw that he was alone. No Vanessa. No Sophie. Just Evan sitting behind the wheel for a long moment before finally opening the door and walking toward my porch. He looked terrible, dark circles under his eyes, clothes rumpled as though he had been sleeping in them if he had been sleeping at all. The confident professional I had watched Vanessa mold over 12 years was gone. In his place was someone I barely recognized, a man carrying a weight so heavy it had bent his entire body. I opened the door before he could knock. Evan stood on my porch, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. Then his face crumpled, and he said the words I had been waiting years to hear. "Dad, I need to tell you something I should have told you years ago." I stepped aside and let him in. He walked to the kitchen table and sat down heavily, the same table where Leonard had spread his evidence weeks before, the same table where Margaret and I had shared thousands of meals and conversations over 4 decades of marriage. I made coffee because I didn't know what else to do, and I set a cup in front of my son and waited. Evan wrapped his hands around the mug but didn't drink. His fingers were trembling. 3 years ago, he began, his voice cracking. 3 years ago, I tried to leave her. I saw what she was doing to you, how she was treating you, and I finally found the courage to say enough. I told her I wanted a divorce. I told her I was going to protect you and Sophie from whatever she was planning. I thought I was being strong. He stopped. His jaw worked silently, fighting against words that did not want to come out. But he continued, then stopped again. She threatened to... He could not finish. Whatever Vanessa had said to him 3 years ago, whatever weapon she had used to break his resistance, it was still sharp enough to cut him even now. I waited. I did not push. Whatever my son was carrying, it was heavier than cowardice, heavier than weakness, heavier than anything I had imagined during all those months of hating his silence. Evan sat in my kitchen, hands shaking, tears streaming down his face. He had kept this secret for 3 years. The reason he stopped fighting the threat that broke him, the choice that cost him his dignity and his relationship with his father. Tonight, for the first time, he was going to tell me the truth, and I knew, watching his broken expression, that the truth was going to change everything I thought I understood about my son. Evan took a deep breath and forced himself to continue. His voice was raw, stripped of all the defenses he had built over years of silence. 3 years ago, he said, I finally confronted her. I told her that the way she treated you was unacceptable, that I could not stand by and watch her disrespect my father anymore. I said if things didn't change, I wanted a divorce. I thought I was being brave. I thought I was finally standing up for what was right. He laughed bitterly, a sound without any humor in it. Vanessa did not yell. She did not cry. She just looked at me with this cold, calculating expression, like she had been waiting for me to make exactly that move. And then she told me what would happen if I chose you over her. Evan's hands tightened around the coffee mug until his knuckles went white. She said if I filed for divorce, she would take Sophie. She would move across the country somewhere I could not follow easily, and she would hire the most expensive lawyers she could find to drag out custody proceedings for years. She said I would spend a decade in court and still end up seeing my daughter only on holidays and summer breaks. She said Sophie would grow up thinking her father abandoned her, that Vanessa would make sure of it. And then she asked me a question I will never forget. His voice broke completely. She asked me if my pathetic father was worth losing my daughter. I sat in silence, absorbing the weight of what my son had just revealed. 3 years of confusion, 3 years of anger, 3 years of wondering why Evan had become so weak and compliant. And now I understood. He had not surrendered out of cowardice. He had surrendered out of love. The wrong kind of love, perhaps. Love that had been weaponized against him, but love nonetheless. I didn't say anything for a long time. When I finally spoke, I asked only one question. Did Sophie know? Evan nodded, tears streaming freely down his face now. She heard everything. She was 13 years old and she was supposed to be asleep, but she heard us arguing and came to the top of the stairs. She heard Vanessa's threat. She heard me give in. She saw me choose silence over fighting for you. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, but the tears kept coming. That night after Vanessa went to bed, Sophie came to my room. She sat on the edge of my bed and took my hand, and she said something that has haunted me ever since. She said, "Dad, I understand. You're doing this for me, but one day when I'm old enough, I'm going to help Grandpa anyway, and there is nothing Mom can do to stop me." I closed my eyes as the full picture finally came into focus. Sophie had been preparing for this moment since she was 13 years old. She had watched her father sacrifice his dignity to protect her, and she had decided with the fierce clarity of a child who sees injustice for what it is that she would find a way to make things right. She had not become my ally despite her father's silence. She had become my ally because of it. Evan's surrender had planted a seed of resistance in his daughter that had been growing in secret ever since. My granddaughter had inherited her grandmother's foresight and her grandfather's patience. And she had added something of her own, a determination that neither of us could have taught her. I reached across the table and took my son's hands in mine. He flinched at the contact as though he expected me to pull away in disgust, but I held on. "You chose Sophie," I said quietly. "That was the only right choice you made." Evan looked up at me, desperate hope flickering in his eyes. I knew what he wanted. He wanted absolution. He wanted me to tell him that everything was forgiven, that we could go back to being the father and son we had been before Vanessa entered our lives, that his years of complicity could be erased with a single emotional conversation. I could not give him that. It would have been a lie, and lies had done enough damage to this family. "I do not forgive what you let happen to me," I continued, holding his gaze. "I do not forgive the Christmas dinners where you sat silent while she insulted me. I do not forgive the phone calls you never made, the birthdays as you forgot the memorial dinner for your mother that you missed because Vanessa had a work thing. Those choices were yours, Evan. You made them, and I cannot pretend they did not hurt." His face crumpled, but I was not finished. "But I understand why you made them. There is a difference between forgiveness and understanding. Forgiveness says the wound does not matter. Understanding says the wound was real, but I can see how it happened. I understand, Evan. I understand that you were trying to protect your daughter, and I understand that Vanessa used your love for Sophie as a weapon against both of us. That does not erase the pain, but it explains it. An explanation is something I can work with." Evan broke down completely, then sobbing like he had not sobbed since he was a child, releasing years of guilt and shame and self-hatred in my kitchen while the coffee grew cold between us. I let him cry. Some wounds need to bleed before they can heal. When he finally composed himself, when the tears had run their course and left behind only exhaustion and something that looked almost like relief, he asked the question I had been waiting for. "What do you need me to do, Dad?" I met his eyes steadily. "Tell the truth. In court. On the record. No matter what it costs. Testify to what Vanessa did, what she threatened, how she manipulated you and controlled the finances and treated me like garbage to be discarded. Tell the truth, Evan. It is the only thing that will set any of us free." He was silent for a long moment, and I could see him calculating the cost. His marriage was already over. His reputation would suffer. Vanessa would fight back with everything she had. But I could also see something else in his eyes, something I had not seen in years. Resolve. "I will do it," he said. "I will tell them everything." We sat in silence as dawn broke through the kitchen window. Gray light slowly filling the room where so much of our family's history had unfolded. The distance between us had not disappeared. Years of hurt could not be erased by a single night of confession. But for the first time in 12 years, we were facing the same direction. We were no longer adversaries, no longer strangers, no longer a father who had been abandoned and a son who had done the abandoning. We were allies, imperfect, wounded, still learning to trust each other again. but allies nonetheless. The final battle was coming. Vanessa would face the consequences of her choices in a courtroom before a judge with the full weight of evidence and testimony arrayed against her. And this time when my son was called to speak, he would not laugh nervously. He would not look away. He would not choose silence over truth. This time, Evan would stand up, and he would finally tell the world what he should have said years ago. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined, more intimate, which somehow made everything feel more intense. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Judith beside me, watching Vanessa across the aisle, watching her lawyer shuffle papers with the nervous energy of a man who knew his case was weak but was being paid to fight anyway. The gallery behind us was sparse but significant. Leonard in the third row. Sophie seated beside him with her grandmother's eyes fixed steadily forward, and in the back corner barely visible, Brenda, who had come despite her declaration that she wanted nothing to do with this mess. Richards, Vanessa's attorney, opened with the strategy I had expected. He painted me as a vengeful patriarch, a bitter old man who could not accept that his son had grown up and built a life independent of his control. He suggested that the frozen accounts were an act of spite, that the lawsuit was retaliation for perceived slights, that the entire case was nothing more than family drama dressed up in legal language. Judith dismantled his arguments methodically. She presented Leonard's evidence: first 5 years of documented financial irregularities transfers, that Evan had never authorized accounts opened without his knowledge, a pattern of manipulation so consistent and so thorough that it could not possibly be coincidental. She showed the emails, Vanessa's own words, discussing how to secure assets before the old man dies, her casual cruelty preserved in digital amber. She presented the forged signatures documents bearing Evan's name and handwriting that experts had confirmed was not his own. Then Evan took the stand. My son walked to the witness chair with the heavy steps of a man approaching his own execution. But when he sat down and raised his right hand to swear his oath, I saw something in his face that I had not seen in years: clarity, purpose, the determination of someone who has finally decided to stop running from the truth. Evan's testimony was calm, factual, and devastating. He described how Vanessa had slowly taken control of their finances, how she had convinced him to sign documents he did not read, how she had threatened to take Sophie if he ever challenged her authority. He spoke about the Christmas dinner, about his nervous laugh, about the shame he had carried every day since watching his father walk out into the snow. He did not make excuses. He did not minimize his own complicity. He simply told the truth, and the truth was more powerful than any argument Richards could construct. But the final blow came from Leonard. Judith called him to the stand as her last witness, and he carried with him a folder I had not seen before. He explained that in the course of his investigation into Vanessa, he had discovered something unexpected, a court case from 15 years ago involving her mother, Brenda. The courtroom went silent as Leonard laid out the details. Brenda had been sued by her late husband's elderly parents, accused of defrauding them of their savings through a scheme remarkably similar to what Vanessa had attempted with me. The case had been settled quietly. The record sealed the whole affair, buried under layers of legal confidentiality. But records exist even when people want them forgotten, and Leonard had found them. The pattern did not start with Vanessa. Leonard said, his voice steady and clear. It was taught to her. Her mother showed her how to target elderly family members, how to manipulate finances, how to use love and obligation as weapons. That does not excuse what Vanessa did, but it explains it. She learned from the best, and she applied those lessons to a new generation. I looked at Vanessa's face as Leonard spoke. She had gone pale, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking, but she was not looking at Leonard or at me. She was looking at Brenda, seated in the back of the courtroom, searching for something: support perhaps, or acknowledgement, or even just eye contact. Brenda would not meet her daughter's gaze. She stared straight ahead, stone-faced, unwilling to acknowledge the legacy she had created. The judge took less than an hour to reach her decision. She ruled entirely in my favor. Vanessa was stripped of all control over Brooks' family finances. She was ordered to repay the funds she had diverted, a sum that would take years to settle. She was permanently banned from any future financial authority over family assets. The trust Margaret had created was restored to its intended function, with me as trustee and Sophie added as a secondary beneficiary. But at my request, there was no criminal prosecution. Judith had argued for charges. Leonard had supported the idea. Even Sophie, my fierce and principled granddaughter, had suggested that Vanessa deserved to face the full consequences of her actions. But I had made my decision, and I explained it to the judge when she asked for my input. I did not want revenge, I said, standing to address the court. I wanted my family to understand something that had been lost over 12 years of manipulation and silence. Respect cannot be taken. It must be earned, and dignity cannot be stolen. It must be surrendered. I refused to surrender mine. I looked at Vanessa as I spoke. She took my peace. She took my relationship with my son. She tried to take my granddaughter's respect, but she could not take my dignity because I never gave it to her. I held on to it through every insult, every exclusion, every moment when she tried to make me feel worthless. And now, standing here, I want her to understand that destroying her was always within my power, and I am choosing not to use it. Not because she deserves mercy, but because I refuse to become the kind of person she tried to make me. The judge nodded slowly, something like respect in her eyes, and rendered her final ruling. Vanessa left the courthouse a diminished woman, stripped of the power she had spent 12 years accumulating, but still free, still employed, still able to be a mother to Sophie, though their relationship would need years to heal. She walked past me in the hallway, and for a moment our eyes met. I expected to see hatred, defiance, the cold calculation that had characterized her for as long as I had known her. Instead, I saw something I had never seen in Vanessa before. Understanding. She finally understood what her mother had never taught her, the lesson Brenda had been too bitter and too broken to learn. Some battles you lose not when your enemy defeats you, but when they choose not to destroy you. Hatred. She could have fought. Cruelty she could have matched. But mercy, genuine mercy from a man she had tried to break, that was a weight she would carry forever. My refusal to destroy her was the heaviest punishment she had ever received, and watching her walk away, shoulders bent under that invisible burden, I knew that Margaret would have approved. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen preparing a Thanksgiving dinner I had not hosted in over a decade. The turkey was smaller than the ones Vanessa used to order, the decorations simpler, the guest list reduced to the only people who truly mattered. But as I watched Sophie move through my home, setting plates on the table with the same careful precision her grandmother once used, I understood that this modest gathering held more warmth than any of the elaborate holiday productions I had endured in recent years. Sophie had arrived early to help, as she always did now. Our relationship had deepened in the months since the trial, built on a foundation of shared purpose and mutual respect that felt unshakable. She was 17 now, finishing her junior year with grades that would open doors to any university she chose, and she had already decided what she wanted to do with her life. Grandpa. She had told me privately just that morning, standing in this same kitchen while the coffee brewed, Grandma left me a mission. I did not understand it when I was 10, but I understand it now. I'm going to study law, elder rights, family protection. I'm going to spend my life making sure what happened to you does not happen to others. I saw Margaret's fire in her eyes when she spoke, that fierce determination to protect the vulnerable and hold the powerful accountable. My wife had planted a seed in our granddaughter years ago, and it had grown into something neither of us could have anticipated. Sophie would carry our family's lessons into a future we would never see, transforming pain into purpose, turning our private struggle into public good. Evan arrived alone as expected. He and Vanessa had separated formally 3 months after the verdict, the divorce proceedings moving forward with surprisingly little conflict. They were co-parenting Sophie, peacefully dividing holidays and maintaining civil communication for their daughter's sake. It was not friendship, but it was not war either. It was the careful navigation of two people who had finally accepted that their marriage had been built on foundations too damaged to support anything lasting. My son looked different than he had at Christmas a year ago. The haunted exhaustion had faded from his face, replaced by something quieter, more grounded. He was seeing a therapist now, working through years of manipulation and complicity, learning to distinguish between the man Vanessa had shaped him into and the man he actually wanted to be. The process was slow, often painful, but I could see the progress every time we met. "Dad," he said as he walked through my front door, and the word carried weight it had not held in years. "The house looks great." "Sophie helped," I replied. "She has her grandmother's eye for making a space feel like home." We sat down to dinner as the afternoon light faded into evening. 3 generations of Brooks gathered around a table that had seen decades of family history. The meal was simple, but good recipes I had learned from Margaret years ago, dishes that tasted like memory and love. We talked about Sophie's college applications, about Evan's new apartment, about the small, ordinary details of lives that were slowly rebuilding themselves. We didn't pretend the past had not happened. That was one of the boundaries we had established in the months since the trial, an agreement to acknowledge the wounds rather than paper over them, with false reconciliation. Evan and I were not the father and son we had been before Vanessa, and we never would be again. Too much had happened. Too many silences had stretched too long. Too many moments of betrayal had accumulated like scar tissue on the heart. But we were becoming something new, something more honest, something built on accountability rather than assumption. "We are not the family we were," I said as we finished our meal, Sophie clearing plates while Evan poured coffee. "But maybe we are becoming the family we should have been." Evan nodded slowly, accepting the truth of it. "Maybe," he said. "I hope so." Later that evening, after Sophie and Evan had gone home, I stood at my window watching the first snow of winter drift down from a darkening sky. The house was quiet in a way that used to feel lonely, but now felt peaceful. I thought about Margaret, about the plans she had left behind, about the network of protection she had woven around me in her final months. I thought about Leonard, who had kept his promise for 5 years without ever being asked. I thought about Judith, who had waited patiently with legal armor ready. I thought about Sophie, who had been preparing since she was 13 to fight a battle she should never have had to face. And I thought about Vanessa. She was in therapy now, working with a counselor who specialized in generational trauma. Sophie had mentioned it casually, the way children mention things they have decided to accept without fully forgiving. Vanessa was trying to understand how her mother's wounds had become her own toxic patterns, how fear had transformed into manipulation, how the survival strategies she learned as a child had nearly destroyed everyone she claimed to love. She was not redeemed. That kind of redemption takes years if it comes at all, but she was not destroyed either, and that mattered to me in ways I had not expected. She had sent Sophie a birthday card last month, 3 words written in her careful handwriting. "I'm trying. Mom." Sophie had kept the card. That told me everything I needed to know about my granddaughter's capacity for grace. I watched the snow fall, each flake catching the light from my window before disappearing into the growing darkness, and I let myself feel something I had not felt in years: peace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of something stronger. The knowledge that I had faced the worst my family could throw at me and emerged with my dignity intact. Revenge would have felt good for a day. Justice would last for generations. I did not win because I was ruthless. I won because I was patient. I did not fight with anger or cruelty. I fought with evidence, with boundaries, with the quiet strength that Margaret always saw in me, even when I could not see it in myself. Some families break beyond repair. Some families find their way back. The difference is not love, because love was never absent from our story. The difference is accountability. The willingness to name what happened, to hold people responsible for their choices, and to rebuild only on foundations that can bear the weight of truth. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply this: living well, living with your dignity intact, living surrounded by the people who earned your trust through action, not just blood. Respect once broken must be rebuilt brick by brick, conversation by conversation, choice by choice. It can never be assumed again. But standing at my window on that Thanksgiving evening, watching the snow fall on a world that had almost taken everything from me, I understood that rebuilt respect might actually be stronger than the kind that was never tested. Margaret had known that. She had planned for it, and now finally I understood what she had been trying to teach me all along. And that is where Walter's story ends. But the lessons it teaches us will stay with me for a long time. What I love most about this story is that Walter never lost himself. He never became cruel. He never stooped to Vanessa's level. He fought with patience, with preparation, and with the quiet dignity that his wife always believed he had. Too often we think revenge means destruction, that justice requires us to burn everything down. But Walter showed us another way. He proved that you can stand up for yourself without losing your soul in the process. If you are watching this and you recognize yourself in Walter's story, if someone in your life is treating you like you do not matter, like you are disposable, like your feelings and your dignity mean nothing, please hear me when I say this: you deserve better. Document everything. Build your case quietly. Find allies who believe in you, and never ever surrender your self-respect to keep a false peace. Silence is not harmony. Silence is slow death. But also remember what Walter chose at the end. He chose mercy. He chose not to destroy Vanessa completely because destroying her would have meant becoming someone he did not want to be. That is the real victory. Not winning the battle, but staying true to who you are while you fight it. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Revenge Room for more stories of justice, dignity, and the quiet power of people who refuse to be broken. Until next time, remember, respect is not given, it is earned, and once it is broken, it must be rebuilt, never assumed again.